Morning never really breaks in this jungle. It just seeps in, gray and heavy over the ridge on Luzon. The air is thick enough to chew, and every leaf seems to sweat. An American platoon lies pressed into the mud, not daring to move. They've learned the price of movement. 2 hours ago, a private only lifted his head to scratch his neck. A single crack from the tree line flipped him into the bottom of the foxhole, dead before he hit. Now, to test the silence, a sergeant inches a helmet up on the end of a bayonet. It rises barely an inch above the lip, just enough to catch a sliver of dawn. The answer is instant. A sharp report snaps across the valley, and the helmet explodes sideways, spinning into the brush. No muzzle flash, no shape, nothing. Just that same invisible Japanese sniper they failed to spot for 48 hours. Men mutter about a ghost in the trees. Then, away from the crowded foxholes, one figure lies alone, stretched flat in the wet earth. He cradles a long, blued steel bolt action with a slender hunting scope, the mail-order deer gun his buddies joked about on the transport. While everyone else hugs cover and swears, he traces angles, light, and foliage, his hand calm on the elevation drum. Because over the next 4 days, this mocked raffle will quietly find 11 ghosts on this ridge and prove just how wrong the laughter was. For the first time, someone hunts back. He didn't grow up around barracks or parade grounds. He grew up around fence lines, cornfields, and the slow, cold patience of a Midwestern morning. Before he ever heard a drill sergeant, he heard the creak of frozen leather and the soft click of a safety easing off, while a whitetail eased out of the tree line. School was a place he endured. The woods were where he paid attention. He learned to read wind from the way smoke bent over the chimney, to judge distance by the size of a squirrel on a limb. When other boys saved for cars or radios, he stacked dollar bills from odd jobs at the garage, stubbornly chasing a single idea, his own rifle. It finally came in a long cardboard box, delivered to the farmhouse like any other piece of mail. Inside was a .30-06 hunting rifle from a thick, smiling catalog. While his father admired the blued steel, he stripped it down to pins and springs on the kitchen table, memorizing each part until he could reassemble it blindfolded. That scope on top, barely 3 power and skinny as a pencil, might as well have been a telescope to him. Then the telegram came, and the Army didn't care about catalog dreams. Basic training replaced cornrows with drill fields. The standard was the M1 Garand, semi-automatic, rugged, beloved by every instructor. His bolt action looked like an antique beside it. When he asked to qualify with his own rifle, NCOs grumbled about regulations and supply records. Only a tired young lieutenant, impressed by his scores, finally nodded. Fine, he could keep the catalog special if he carried issued ammo and never slowed the platoon. Months later, when the transport ramp slammed down onto a steaming Pacific beach, laughter followed him down the line. You don't bring a deer rifle to war, they said. But on this island, the Japanese snipers were already proving that patience and precision were exactly how wars in the jungle would be decided. The veterans whispered these hills already belonged to unseen rifles in the trees above. Within days of landing, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every advance bled men. The enemy's rifles were rarely seen, only heard, a flat crack that seemed to arrive from the whole tree line at once. The Japanese had folded themselves into the jungle canopy, into hollowed coconut trunks and spider holes, until the terrain felt armed. When the platoon moved forward, something unseen in the leaves decided who stayed standing. They were armed with Type 97 and Type 99 sniper rifles, low-powered optics by standards, but more than enough for men who had memorized every fold of these ridges. They knew where sound bounced, where the sun flashed off metal, how long it took an American to expose himself when he thought it was safe. One squeeze on a trigger could freeze 100 boots in place, and it usually did. On paper, American doctrine had answers. You beat an ambush with aggression. You poured on fire, you maneuvered, you pushed through before the enemy could adjust. On the parade grounds and rifle ranges back home, it all made sense. Out here, in ravines choked with roots and knife-edge ridgelines, it felt like running into a meat grinder that fired single perfect shots instead of bursts. Mortars and artillery were supposed to level the scales. When a sniper pinned them, they called for steel. Shells strode across the tree line, trunks burst, palm fronds scissored down like green rain. For a few minutes, the ridge became smoke, splinters, concussion. Then the guns fell silent, and someone had to test the quiet. A helmet, a raised shoulder, the briefest profile. The answer came back, one round, from somewhere different. The rifles the Americans carried were never meant for this kind of duel. The M1 Garand's iron sights were rugged, beautifully simple, and zeroed for center mass at 200 to 300 yards, perfect for a standing man, useless for a cheekbone hiding behind 3 layers of foliage at 350. On the range, under bright sun, a good shot might pick out a helmet. Here, everything beyond 50 yards was just green noise. The men in the trees played by older rules. Japanese snipers trained to hold a position until their legs went numb, to let insects crawl under their clothes without swatting, to eat and relieve themselves without shifting their weight. They could wait an entire day for one officer to point, one radio man to lift a handset. That kind of patience wasn't in any American manual. The books didn't imagine an enemy who could
advise a company alone. The platoon started collecting stories that sounded like superstition but came with dog tags attached. A radio man hit clean through the handset as he tried to call for smoke. A squad leader dropped in the instant his hand rose to signal a flanking move. A machine gun team frozen for 20 minutes because a single bullet had stitched the dirt an inch from the gunner's eye. Each neat little hole in steel whispered the same warning. Higher up the hill, the orders remained the same. Push through, close with, and destroy the enemy. Maps in the command tent showed arrows, phase lines, objectives. They didn't show the invisible web of sight lines that crisscrossed every ridge, or the single patient rifle that could shut down a valley. On paper, American firepower outweighed anything the defenders possessed. On the ground, doctrine and issued equipment were quietly losing a very personal kind of duel. Losses didn't come as big dramatic battles. They arrived as single perfect shots that punched neat holes in the platoon. On the first day they pushed off the perimeter toward the interior hills. The lead scout never made it 10 steps past the last strand of rusted wire. He was a wiry kid from Oklahoma, always first in line, moving slow and careful with his muzzle low. One moment he was there, the next a bullet whipped in from nowhere and folded him into the dirt without a sound. No burst, no shouted orders, just that flat crack and the dead weight of a man hitting the trail. Instinct did what doctrine had taught. Men wheeled, dropped to a knee, and poured fire into the tree line. A machine gun team slammed their weapon onto a fallen log and stitched an entire slope from left.
Should have been a shield had become a bullseye. The answer from higher never really changed. Bring up the big guns. Browning machine guns chewed through belts, sweeping whole ridges. Mortars thumped, dropping rounds into clumps of jungle that looked right on a map. Each time, the Americans spent steel and sweat raking suspected hides. Smoke rose, palm fronds rained down, and then the ridge went quiet again. As ammunition stacks shrank, stories filled the empty spaces. Men whispered about Japanese snipers who could lie still for days, who counted heartbeats between breaths, who aimed for trigger fingers and radio hands. Some of it was rumor, some of it true, all of it corrosive. Confidence began to crumble. Patrol leaders bargained for later step-off times so darkness could cover the first 100 yards. No one wanted to be the man whose lazy gesture bought the enemy another perfect shot. From his place in the line, the man with the mail-order rifle watched the platoon thin out. The steady talkers and professionals vanished onto litters and into landing craft bound for hospital ships. These weren't men short on courage. They had already proven themselves in assaults. What they lacked here wasn't will, it was preparation. Iron sights, poor visibility, and a total absence of real counter-sniper technique at their level were killing them one by one. One evening, after another friend was carried off with a tight bandage around his neck and eyes gone dull, he sat alone beside his foxhole and listened to the jungle buzz. Then he unrolled his cleaning kit on an ammo crate, set out a few scavenged screws and a thin strip of metal, and laid his bolt action across his knees. What he was about to do wasn't in any field manual, and his sergeant would have shut it down in a heartbeat. But the manuals weren't stopping the bullets. As the light bled out of the trees, he made a quiet decision. If command couldn't give them a counter, he would build one himself. The perimeter was a crooked ring of foxholes and sandbags hacked into the hillside, more mud than fortification. Inside it, men cleaned weapons, smoked in silence, and pretended not to listen for that distant, solitary rifle crack. At the edge of the line, away from the card games and nervous jokes, he set his mail-order rifle on an ammo crate. He breathed once, rolled his shoulders, and began stripping it down, piece by piece, as if he were back at the kitchen table on his father's farm. First came the screws, turned out carefully and lined in order on a scrap of oily cloth so they wouldn't disappear into the muck. Then he lifted the barreled action from the stock with a soft wooden sigh. He ran his thumb along the channel underneath, feeling every swollen high spot where wet wood pressed against steel. Every touch point meant pressure. Every bit of pressure meant a shot that might wander inches at 300 yards. In this game, inches were the difference between an enemy corpse and another folded blanket. He took out his knife and shaved away thin curls of wood until the barrel lay free, no longer pinched in a damp vise. A dab of scavenged wax went into the inletting where metal met stock, his fingertips smoothing it into a thin, glassy bed. When he settled the action back and snugged the screws in sequence, the rifle felt tighter, somehow more honest. Over him, Martinez lounged in the foxhole and frowned. "You planning to impress the Japs with woodworking?" he muttered.
Or did that fancy deer gun finally break? He didn't look up. "It's not broken," he said. "I'm just making it tell the truth." He checked the slim scope rings he bolted on back home, running a finger over each screw head, then giving it a precise quarter turn. Alignment, tension, nothing left to chance. Beyond the perimeter, a dead coconut trunk stuck up from the slope, a dented K ration tin wired halfway up its side for target practice. He eased the rifle to his shoulder, glassed the tin, and felt the world narrow to bark grain, rust, and a circle of dull metal. Through the 3-power scope, the jungle stopped being a wall of green and broke into layers. Bark texture here, a peeling strip there, a faint line of shadow where the tin's edge cut across the trunk. "Your Garand ever show you that?" he asked quietly. Martinez snorted. "My Garand shows me 8 rounds fast," he shot back. "That's what wins fights." "At 50 yards, sure," he answered. "But these guys are sitting at 300, 400, and they only need 1. He ticked the elevation drum 2 clicks, already doing the drop in his head. "M2 ball falls about 8 inches between 2 and 300, he said. "I spent years reading tables while you were chasing girls." He settled the crosshairs on the lower edge of the tin and breathed out. The shot cracked across the valley, sharp and clean. Half a heartbeat later, the ration can leapt, spun, and clanged against the dead trunk before dropping into the brush. Men nearby turned, watching. He worked the bolt, resettled, and hit it again, this time center, punching a fresh, ragged hole through thin steel. "That's a can," Martinez said slowly. "Not a sniper." He nodded. "A can that doesn't move is still smaller than a man's head. And out there, that's all we ever see of them." The little knot of onlookers shifted uneasily, glancing at the tree line. He let the silence hang a moment, then spoke lower. "We keep spraying whole hillsides and hoping. They're picking hearts, hands, radios. This isn't a job for 8 fast shots. It's a job for 1 careful one." The idea scared them, but it also made uncomfortable sense. That night, when the jungle turned to a solid wall of black and lanterns punched small holes in it, he took the rifle and walked to the command post. The lieutenant was hunched over a map, casualty list folded under his hand. He listened, jaw tight, as the idea came out in steady sentences. 1 man, 1 rifle, working ahead of the line, hunting the flashes and wrong shadows before they claimed another name. On paper, regulations said no. Habit said no, but the paper under his fingers said something else. After a long silence, the officer sighed. "All right, unofficial. You pick your ground, you stay off the radio, and nobody writes the word sniper unless this works." The handshake felt heavier than any shouted order out here now. Stepping back into the humid dark, rifle balanced in his hands, he knew the next 4 days would either justify his rebellion or bury it with him. The next morning he moves before anyone can tell him not to. Dawn is only a gray smear over the ridge when he slips out of the line, crawls on elbows and knees through wet grass, and settles onto a rubble-strewn knoll that once held a shack. From here he can see into the folds of the opposite slope, into the crowns of the palms that have ruled this valley. He plants the forked stick he carved the night before, lashes a pair of captured Japanese binoculars to it with signal wire, and lets the glass and the rifle scope overlap, layer on layer. Through them, the jungle stops being a wall and becomes a puzzle. He ignores trunks and branches, and hunts instead for straight lines, tiny circles, shadows that do not breathe with the rest. For long minutes there is nothing. Then high in a lonely palm he sees it, a pinprick of white that appears, vanishes, then flashes again as fronds sway. Not a man, just a few millimeters of reflected glass. He times the rhythm of the wind, leads the invisible eye behind that glint, and lets his breath fall away. The rifle cracks. For a heartbeat, nothing changes. Then the crown of the palm convulses, and a limp shape tumbles through the fronds, hitting the ground with a dull thud that carries all the way back to the perimeter. For the first time, the platoon sees a sniper as a body at the base of a tree, not just a rumor in the leaves. By the second day, the story has outrun him. Men who barely knew his name now watch him move with a wary, hungry respect. The lieutenant does not bother with speeches. He just jerks his chin toward the ridge. This time the hunter brings a prop, a spare helmet wired to a broken rifle, and awkward fishing pole for ghosts. From a shallow dip in the ground, he inches the decoy up until a sliver of steel shows above the brush, as if some nervous private has made a mistake. The response is instant. A shot slams into the helmet, tearing paint and steel. He does not flinch. While echoes bounce and leaves settle, he counts under his breath, mapping the angle from the impact back to where he lies. Then he turns the scope along that invisible line, inch by inch, until the jungle's random shapes betray one that is not random at all. One branch is cut, not broken. Behind it, a narrow channel of cleared foliage runs back into shadow. At its end, barely wider than a fist, a dark oval waits. The crosshairs settle on that small, stubborn geometry. One squeeze, one crack, and a body pitches sideways out of its hide, swallowed almost at once by green. He repeats the pattern through the heat and into the third day, never firing twice from the same piece of ground. He learns to read the fine print of their concealment. Bark rubs smooth where a man has climbed too often. Powder scars on a palm trunk where muzzle blast has burned the fibers. A hut wall whose one innocent knothole is perfectly aligned with the likely trail. When he cannot see ahead, he aims for the loophole that must feed it. Every shot is deliberate, every shot from a cold barrel. By the end of day 3, 5 enemy sniper rifles lie.
The rest, a rigid pocket in a sea of slow-breathing green. The branches around it move in time with the wind. This one seems anchored to something solid and human behind it. He eases the rifle into his shoulder, every muscle protesting. Now the world shrinks to numbers and feel. Range, a little over 300 yards, judged by the known distance between 2 outcrops. Humidity and heat, enough to soften the air, to drag the bullet down a fraction more than the tables back home would suggest. A faint crosswind funnels down the valley, brushing his right cheek. He ticks the elevation drum, makes a tiny hold into the wind, and lets his finger take up the slack on the trigger. Time stretches. The narrator in his own head goes quiet. When the shot breaks, it feels almost gentle, just a sharp push into his shoulder. Almost at the same instant, an answering crack whips overhead, close enough that the air seems to tear along his scalp. For a frozen second, he thinks he has lost. Then, bark explodes from a tree behind him, where the enemy's round has passed high and wide, and the unmoving patch of leaves on the far slope collapses inward like a deflating lung. Later, when a patrol claws its way up to that perch, they find a narrow nest carved into the trunk and a rifle dangling from its sling, swaying slightly above the drop. That makes 11 snipers in 4 days. Back on the line, men stare at the mail-order bolt action with a different kind of awe. The joke rifle has become the most trusted weapon on the ridge, and the man behind its scope has just rewritten how this platoon plans to survive. In the days that followed, the change along the ridge was subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Patrols still stepped off with tight jaws and sweaty palms, but boots no longer felt welded to the ground. Men moved from stump to stump with the wary confidence of people who knew someone was watching over them, not just watching them die. The invisible fingers that had gripped every helmet, every raised elbow, began to loosen. There were still bursts of fire, still sudden contacts in the green, but the single surgical shots from the tree line grew rare. For the first time since landing on the island, there were days when no one was carried back on a litter. The platoon did not call it victory. They called it breathing room. The company commander, who had watched the casualty board thicken page by page, took special care with the next report. In his cramped tent, under a swaying lantern, he wrote out the bare facts in the blunt language the Army preferred. 11 enemy snipers located and destroyed within 4 days, all by the same marksman using a scoped bolt-action rifle at platoon level. He added a note that was not required by any form. The employment of a trained rifleman in a dedicated counter-sniper role, he wrote, had materially reduced friendly casualties and restored forward momentum in the sector. He did not waste ink on adjectives. He knew there was a good chance no one beyond regimental headquarters would ever read past the first paragraph. Paper, he had learned, could be ignored. Stories could not. Within a week, runners and mess sergeants were whispering about the man on Luzon whose catalog special was killing ghosts in the trees. A mortar section from another company showed up one afternoon with a battered Springfield they had dug out of supply and a civilian scope wrapped in oilcloth, asking quiet questions about mounting screws and zero ranges. Soon, spare rifles that had once been relegated to training details reappeared on firing lines, their hand-me-down optics held in place with tape, wire, and stubborn hope. No one announced a change in doctrine. They just started bending the rules until the rules fit the reality they were living in. The story on that ridge was not unique, only unusually well documented. Across the Pacific and in the ruined cities of Europe, other quiet men with hunting backgrounds and obsessive streaks were making similar, unofficial leaps. A Marine in the Solomons lashed a civilian scope to an old Springfield and started logging confirmed hits beyond any range his manual had suggested.
and infantrymen in Italy learned to use church towers and shattered chimneys as hides, turning urban rubble into improvised nests. None of them were following a neatly printed chapter titled Sniper Employment. They were writing it, one trigger pull at a time, often in the margins of after-action reports, and in the grudging respect of officers who liked results more than regulations. In time, the institution caught up with the improvisers. Late-war training pamphlets began to circulate, thin booklets that suddenly contained sections on concealed observation, counter-sniper tactics, and the advantages of a scoped bolt-action rifle in certain conditions. After the guns finally fell silent, officers who had watched their attacks stall under invisible fire pushed for more permanent answers. The Army and Marine Corps stood up formal sniper schools, invested in purpose-built rifles, standardized optics, and a training pipeline that treated patience, fieldcraft, and marksmanship as a specialized craft rather than a hobby for farm boys and hunters. What had begun as a series of half-sanctioned field modifications hardened into doctrine. None of that was written on the box that came home to a small farm after the war. The rifle arrived with its bluing worn thin along the stock, pits of rust blossoming near the muzzle where jungle rain had eaten the steel, and a faint scar on the wood where shrapnel had once kissed it and glanced away. He cleaned it again on a kitchen table, older hands repeating younger motions, then hung it over the mantel where his father had always said it belonged. To visitors, it looked like any other hunting rifle, a tool for venison and coyotes. Only he knew how many long, sweating hours it had spent pointed at leaves that refused to move, how many lives had quietly shifted course at the tug of its trigger. History tends to remember divisions and generals, factory output and tonnage shipped across oceans. It is comfortable with numbers that can be printed in neat columns and compared to an enemy's totals. Harder to print is the moment when one unremarkable soldier, sick of watching friends fall to a problem no one seems able to solve, decides to trust his own hands more than the issued answer. On paper, he is just another private, one serial number among millions. In practice, on that ridge, he became the hinge between a unit pinned down by fear and a unit able to move again. That tension between doctrine and initiative never really disappears. Every war begins with manuals written for the last one, and every new battlefield exposes the blind spots those pages never imagined. Somewhere, early in every campaign, somebody at the lowest level looks at the tools in his hand